Hi everyone, so welcome to another episode of welfordWEAVES. My name is Rachel and I can be found on Instagram as Woolen Spinning and on Ravelry as Welford Pearls. I hope that you're doing really well. I hope this finds you really well. I can't believe that we are already into November. It is just crazy to me. And I feel like this time of year should be, or I don't like to should on people, but, that we aspire to sort of hunker down and hibernate a little bit at this time of year and find some time for ourselves, get onto our wheels, get onto our looms, work on that equipment that, tends to stay home while we're out in the summer and in the sun and at the beach and camping and doing all these things. And those things, that the heavier equipment stays home and it sort of waits for us until the seasons start to change and we get to that time of year where we can hunker down a little bit, make a warm mug of tea and sit at our looms or sit at our wheels. And I hope that that's what you have an opportunity to do over the next coming months. I certainly have been really intentionally trying to carve out that time. And sometimes it's difficult, sometimes it's not easy, but I think with continued intentionality, it becomes easier and easier. So I wanted to talk a little bit more today about the Crackle towels, and I thought that I would include some footage of me actually weaving said towels. I know it's sometimes confusing when we're talking about these weave structures and we're looking at images and we're looking at photos and stuff, and it's sort of like, yeah, but like, what does it look like on the loom? So let's do that. So before we run the intro credits and whatnot, I just wanted to sort of reorient you to what it is that I'm working on. I introduced these to you in the last episode. They are the Stash Crackle Pop towels available on Jane Stafford's website. It was a pattern that was designed by Sharon Broadley, and it takes a draft from Marguerite Porter Davison's book, A Hand Weaver's Pattern book. So the draft comes straight out of the Crackle section of the book, which is towards the end. So back here, page 117, if you have one of the reprinted copies of the book. And the draft is called A Scandinavian Favorite, and it's back here. And that's what the pattern, the tea towel pattern is based on. So when you download the pattern, these are some of the possibilities of the combinations that you can do to make the towels. So let's talk a little bit more about Crackle. Let's define Crackle a little bit better. And let me introduce to you as well what classic Crackle is, because there is Crackle in the way that we all kind of think of Crackle, and then there's also classic Crackle. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So let's talk about Crackle. Crackle was named by Mary Meigs Atwater, so many of you know who Mary Atwater is, in 1928 after she had been writing about it for over a year. It comes from, I'm going to say this wrong, but I hope that I'm close enough, from Jämtlands in Sweden. So I have seen it written three different ways, Crackle. I've seen Crackle written Jämtlands drawl or drill, Jämtlands vav, and I've also seen it Jämtlands vav, but spelt a different way. So I've seen all three of those different spellings for Crackle from Sweden in different texts and different books. And it does seem to matter where you're looking and what you're looking at. Harriet Tibball in 1946 actually standardized the blocks. And Mary Schneider, who wrote this helpful little booklet that is a workshop. I'll explain that in just a few more minutes. I'll expand on that. She continued to use Harriet Tibball's standardization of the Crackle blocks. So like I mentioned last time, there were several different people writing about Crackle, and they assigned different blocks different numbers, and they shaft sequences they assigned differently. They're all basically the same, and they all basically weave the same thing. But Harriet Tibball said, let's just make it simple so that we can also know where to put the incidentals in, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so that's what she did. And that's what Mary Schneider continued to use. So this little book, I talked about it last time as well. It's actually not that difficult to find. There's actually a lot of secondhand, copies out there of this. And this was reprinted in 1989. So this one is from 1961. And then there's another reprinting from 1989. I have been torn about maybe getting that just so that I have both and I can compare the two. But I haven't done that yet. So this little ditty is actually a workshop, and it reads like a workshop. So imagine yourself sitting down at a desk and somebody's standing up at the front. Let's imagine that it's Mary Schneider. I have a hair in my eye. I just have to move my bangs. And let's imagine that Mary Schneider is standing up in front of us, and let's imagine that instead of reading the written word, that she's actually speaking to us through this book. And so while I've been reading this, I've been like, oh, this is like, like a course outline for a workshop. That's what it reads like, and that's sort of what it looks like. So she doesn't give you a lot of extra in terms of theory or information. It's really just workshop exercises one after another. So it's, lesson 3, contemporary fabrics. Here's your draft. Here's what to expect from it. Weave on either of the drafts, either in the manners of weaving, lesson 1, which sends you back to the beginning of the book, or woven with 6 cut chenille pattern. Gold rayon boucle tabby is most effective, giving a semi-pile surface. And that's all she gives you. And so very, very simple instructions. And the idea is that you take her guidance and guidelines and take them to the loom and weave it and actually learn what she wants you to learn on the loom in real time. So this really does read as a workshop. And if that's not something that is a natural, intuitive way for you to learn, this book would be really overwhelming. On the other hand, if you actually work through the exercises, especially the ones that at the beginning that are all classified under basic units, that's what she calls them, the basic units class, I think she calls it, it's very helpful. And I can see now basic drafts, that's what it's called, lesson number 1. Right there at the top, lesson number 1, and then lesson 1A, and she goes from there. If you learn by doing, and you're a kinetic learner, or you're an experiential learner, or you lean that way, then this book would be really helpful. Even just to sit down and read and puzzle through the problems, quote unquote, that she gives you to solve. Sort of like what Mary Black does in her books in The New Key to Weaving. She does a very similar approach. And I think it's just one of those things with weaving, you've got to get on the loom and you have to do the thing. So it makes sense that that's the case, that is how these books are written and how they would have been written in the middle of the 20th century when people were maybe, still very cottage industry, weaving by themselves or in small groups that they would do studies together. And of course, a lot of this stuff, they were rediscovering some of it, relearning some of it, and trying to look at, different ways of weaving that had sort of been used up to that point as things were changing. So, Margaret Porter Davison in her book, she does include a chapter in her book that are the Crackle chapter that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. They're very classic traditional Swedish designs, or they're derivations of overshot. So there are patterns in here, like I mentioned, but they are very traditional Swedish overshot patterns, or they're, like I said, derivations of overshot. The other 2 books that I have found extremely helpful has been this book by Lucy Brusick called A Crackle Weave Companion. Now, the problem with this book, it's excellent, don't get me wrong. The problem with this book is if you don't have Margaret Porter Davison's book and you don't have Mary Atwater's book, The Recipe Book, that's what it's called, The Recipe Book by Mary Atwater, and you don't have Mary Schneider's book, this book becomes a little bit more challenging because she's actually speaking directly to the drafts and the patterns given in those 3 books in this book. So if you don't have those books, this book becomes a little bit more difficult, because she actually goes through in this book all of those drafts from these old books. So if you look here, this one is actually the draft from, oh, that's not a good example, Pioneer Trail and Crackle Ripple Diamond. Those are both from Schneider's books and Marguerite Porter Davison, I think. Blooming Leaf is used from both Schneider and Davison. Pioneer Trail is from Davison. Crackle Ripple Diamond is from, I feel like it's from Schneider. Anyhow, if you don't have those books, this book becomes a little bit more challenging. However, notwithstanding, the theory in this is excellent. So that's a book to think about. Now, this book is really interesting. This is by Susan Wilson, Weave Classic, Crackle, and More. And more refers to different color combinations that you can create and make, as well as weaving overshot manner, and some of the other treadling sequences that you can use that Lucy goes into in her book. So weaving, twills, point twill, bird's eye twill, Rhodes path, weaving overshot rose fashion, weaving overshot star fashion, all that different stuff, as well as multi-shaft. So looking at Crackle on more than just 4 shafts. There is so much that you can do with Crackle on 4 shafts that both authors actually say you can go to 8 shafts with Crackle, and you can absolutely do that, and do that if you have a loom that's capable of doing that. But if you don't have a loom that's capable of more than 4 shafts, don't worry about it, because what you can do with Crackle and the depth that you can go and the amount that you can go, you'll never run out of options. So, which is kind of a nice thing to read, because I feel like so often in hand weaving we hear more shafts, more shafts, more shafts, fancier looms, and it's nice to come across a weave structure that actually works incredibly well on 4 shafts and 4 shafts alone. We will talk about classic Crackle later in this episode. It is fascinating. I have kind of dove into this deep dive of what classic Crackle can do color-wise, and it's pretty cool. So let's continue on. Somebody made a comment on the YouTube channel and asked a great question, and I can't remember who it was now off the top of my head. If I spent the time to go and look, I would find out. But they said, what would be the purpose of using Crackle? Why would we use Crackle over something else? What's that all about? So classically and traditionally, and the way that Mary Atwater introduced Crackle, it was sort of used for upholstery, for bags, and for crosses in liturgical stoles. And the reason for that is because the Crackle shape makes such a strong cross, because compared to overshot patterns, Crackle is much blockier, and they're larger graphics. And because of that blockiness and that larger aesthetic, and the sharp lines that you can get, it was often used for anything that was related to the church and to liturgical stoles, and that type of stuff. So it's really interesting to me that when you start to sort of think about these different things, nowadays we've got people like Jane Stafford out there who are really saying, sure, that's maybe what the structure was used for. Absolutely, that's sort of what it was geared towards. However, what can we do with it now? And with the yarns that we have available, the yarns that we can spin, the yarns that we can make, what can we do to modernize these graphics and to bring them up into the 21st century? And one of the things that was really brought home to me in terms of modernization and really weaving some of this stuff for the 21st century was the overshot scarf that I'm working on right now in the Radnor breed and color study that we're doing in our community. I've been using the Radnor as my pattern yarn, and it's this draft that Jane took from Marguerite Porter Davison's overshot section in the small motifs section, turned it on its side to look at it in a different way, and realized that it probably had been written with the book turned sideways, the draft was actually probably meant to be read in a different orientation on the page, and then took that aesthetic and modernized it with the yarns and the commercial yarns that we have available to us. And we're doing that now with Crackle and, Petit Point, and what else is out there? I mean, it just goes on and on and on. M's and O's and M's and W's and some of the other twill threadings that we can create. I did bird's eye twill for my twill gamp, and like bird's eye twill threaded, but then treadled in all these different ways. I mean, all of a sudden you've just got all of these options in terms of modern graphic color and weave effects, dark light in the warp, dark light in the weft, all these different things that you can put together, bringing, different yarns in to really modernize log cabin. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So where Crackle traditionally has been sort of upholstery, bags, crosses for liturgical stoles, don't be confined by that. Sharon Broadley used Crackle to design these tea towels, and we're using it with 8-2 cotton. The thing is that Crackle does tend to weave a very sturdy cloth, and so that is part of it. When we are creating a sturdier cloth, we do tend to go more toward, outerwear, like coating, upholstery, bags, that type of stuff. But that doesn't mean that that's what we have to weave. We have to be careful that we don't open the set too much and make a really gauzy, lacy fabric. But on the other hand, there is such a thing as Crackle lace, and people do use it to weave curtains. So, I mean, we're only hamstrung by our own desires around what we want to make and the parameters that we put around projects. So definitely think of Crackle as just another option in terms of we could weave something in plain weave, we could weave it in twill, we could weave it in Crackle, we could weave it in overshot. So think of it more as just one of our many tools in our toolbox of design possibilities. All right, so what is Crackle? What is Crackle not? Crackle is a 3-shaft twill block. It is woven on 4 shafts to create 4 blocks. It is not a unit weave because the blocks do not weave independently of one another. So you always get an adjacent block weaving when you weave a certain block. So when A block weaves, so too does B block. When B block weaves, so too does C block. When C block weaves, so too does D block. And when D block weaves, I'm sure you can figure this one out, so too does A block. So the other 2 blocks that are, they become our background. So if we're weaving B block for, let's say, C block is also going to be weaving. And that means that A and D block become our background. And I'll show you an example of that in sort of up here on the screen while I'm talking so that you can see how that rule works. So one of the rules in Crackle is that we don't have any warp or weft floats that are longer than 3 ends. And that makes it really easy because when you're designing, if you're looking at your pattern and all of a sudden you've got a warp float going over 4, you know that you've missed an incidental. And I'll talk about what incidentals are in just a moment. When we're weaving a pattern block, our weave goes over 3 warps and under 1 because we've got a 3-point twill. So it's going to go over 3 and under 1, and then they can, so that way they can stack up in a column. For our background floats, blocks, we weave under 3 warps and over 1. So we always have that thread tacking it down every fourth thread, which makes it really easy because again, if you have warp floats that are going over 4, you know that you've missed something. You know there's something wrong in your threading, or that you've missed an incidental transitioning between blocks. You know there's something wrong. I already mentioned this, but Crackle does tend to be larger. It tends to be blockier than overshot. In overshot, we can get really small pattern motifs, and we can get lots of curving and finer detail than we can in Crackle. With Crackle, we're looking at more like blocks. So there are limitations for both, but we sort of get more of a big pattern graphic on our weaving, whereas with overshot, we can create smaller patterns and smaller motifs. There are limitations to both, which we'll talk about in a minute. All right, so I wanted to spend some time just talking about incidentals really quickly. Incidentals sound really complicated and they sound really difficult to understand, but they actually are really straightforward. So if we have, I'm just gonna make this a little bit bigger for you guys so that you can really see it. So this is just in Fiberworks. So if we have a block, let's just start with A block because that's just the easiest thing to do. So A block goes 1, 2, 3, 2. That's it, that's A block. Now, if we're looking at this in a profile, we're just gonna see A block. That's it, that's all we're gonna see. And we're not gonna see how A block becomes B block, okay? So let's say we have 2 of A block, and then we're gonna have 2 of B block, and then we're gonna have 2 of C block, and we're gonna have 2 of D block. That's our profile draft. And we don't need to worry about the individual threads, and we don't need to worry about the incidentals of how we get from A block to B block. We can just leave it as there's 2 blocks of A, and then there's 2 blocks of B, and there's 2 blocks of C, and so on. Okay, so let's just do a point twill just to keep it really simple. So this is our profile draft. Now, what happens if we want to actually design the individual threads? What happens if we aren't really sure where our incidentals are going to go and we're not really sure how that's going to look as we're threading at the loom and we just want more information? Easy peasy. All right, so I've got 2 of A block here. So I've got A block, and this is using Harriet Tidball's standardized drafting, okay? So we're just gonna use Harriet's because it's super easy. Block A is 1, 2, 3, 2. Block B is 2, 3, 4, 3. I'll put them down here and then you guys can see what each of the individual blocks are. So we're gonna do 2 of block A. So 1, 2, 3, 2. And then we're gonna do another A block. 1, 2, 3, 2. Perfect, that's our 2A block. So here's our first A block that ends right here. And here's our second A block that ends right there. Now, if we go to B block actually starts on 2. B block is 2, 3, 4, 3. But we need something in between here to help us. And Harriet keeps it really simple. If you have an A block and you need an incidental in between to bridge that gap between A block and your next block, A block incidental is 1. B block is 2, C block is 3, and D block is 4. Super easy. So let's do 2 of B block. 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3. Now, this is B block, so we need our incidental before we can go to C block because C block starts on the 3rd thread as well. So we need an incidental in here to bridge that gap to our C block from B block. So it's B block, A block was thread 1, B block, we need thread number 2. All right, so we put our incidental in here so that we can start our block C. So block C starts on thread 3 as well, on 3. So 3, 4, 1, 4. That's our block C. So we're going to do that again. 3, 4, 1, 4. Now it's block C, so then the thread that goes with that one is 3. So there's our incidental right there, number 3. And we're going to do our block D. So 4, because remember, block D starts on thread 4 as well, same as block C. So we're going to go 4, 1, 2, 1, 4, 1, 2, 1. And then our incidental for block D is 4. But because our draft is over, we don't need an incidental. This is our the end of our draft. So we can put, you know, if we wanted to, we could put point twill here to finish our border. Maybe we did that on the other side as well. But for our purposes, we're just going to keep it simple, and we're gonna start our draft there. So that becomes our threading, and that's where our incidentals need to pop in. Now let's say that from block D, we're going to go to block B. We're just going to throw caution to the wind and we're going to try something different. Now block B is 2 steps away from block D. So we need our incidental for block D, but then we also need another thread in there for our block to get to block B. So we can go to block B from block D either by going down through our block C or up through block A. So we need either a 3 for block C or a 1 for block A, for the skipped block. And that's up to you. You can decide which way you go, as long as you stay in the twill circle. So I'm going to go through block A. So because I want to keep climbing. So I'm going to go from D block, my incidental, A block, so A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. I'm going to do my number 1 for my A block, and then I'm going to start my B block. 2, 3, 4, 3. 2, 3, 4, 3. Okay. So now our profile draft would look like this: 2, 2, 2. But then when we got to D, we went down to B. So that's why we skipped block. We either went up to A or we went down through C. So we need that incidental. So when we're threading this, we would make sure that we have an incidental in there like we did. We added that extra incidental. Okay, does that make sense? So that's how incidentals work. And that's one of the really cool things about Crackle, is you don't have to go in block order. You just have to include the incidentals that you need to bridge to the next block. So you could do your whole scarf on just A block and B block. A block and C block, or your whole thing on B block and D block, as long as you have those incidentals that give you the bridge that you need to get to that block that you skipped. It's pretty cool. So then what does this look like when we weave it? So if we have, sorry, I'm on the wrong screen. If we have 2 A blocks here, let's weave 2, 2B, 2C, 2D, and then we went to B block. So we'd get that line across, and we get kind of like an on opposite. So we maybe want to go, we did our incidental based on our A block. So maybe we want to add a pick of A, and then we'll go to B block, and then maybe we repeat. You can play with this, you can do whatever you want, but that's how incidentals work. And that's how we get our graphic. So now our profile draft is going to look like this over here. So with this graphic over here, we would be writing in our pattern, use tabby in between, and weave this in the manner of overshot. And this would be our profile draft. So if somebody was really comfortable with Crackle and they knew about the incidentals, and they knew what to weave, they would go over here and they would just use the profile draft. Okay, I want to weave my block A to square. I'm going to do that. Weave my block B to square, put my tabby in between, and you're done. And this draft doesn't need to show the tabbies in between, because you just know that in between each of these pattern picks that you're also weaving a pick of plain weave. So A, B, A, B, A, B in between, just like we do in overshot. So in the manner of overshot, or traditionally treadled Crackle. That makes sense? Ask questions if it doesn't make sense. This is something kind of different. This is classic Crackle. And if you're interested in learning more about classic Crackle, Susan goes into it in quite a lot of detail in her book, and it is fascinating. I've just done an extremely simple draft here. I've taken Scandinavian favorite from the Stash Crackle Pop Towels from Marguerite Porter Davidson's book. And I have just put in an extremely simple 1 block treadling so that you guys can kind of see the color play that we can get. And if you look at the cover of this book, I mean, you can see the depth and the richness of color that we can get in Crackle. And this is actually what drew me to Crackle in the first place, was like, how do we get that kind of color mixing? Like, that is so cool. So if you look below here, and I've only done one block of each for the treadling. So think of this more of that we would do multiple squares, that it would be built out a little bit more and everything would be a bit more blocky. But what I want you to look at specifically is, if our ground X is the dark bluey purple and the other tealy blue is the other ground Y, and then we've got this gorgeous pattern yarn in between that's that kind of brighter fuchsia-y kind of purple, and probably I should have made that one the turquoise so that you could really see that was the pattern, but hindsight's 2020 when I'm actually explaining this in real time. So just bear with me. When we're weaving classic Crackle, we are no longer weaving on in an overshot manner or in traditional Crackle, which is really confusing because there's like traditional Crackle and then there's classic Crackle. So as I've been reading and learning, I've actually found that really confusing. So we'll call it in the manner of overshot. So pattern, tabby, pattern, tabby, pattern, tabby. This is classic Crackle, and this is woven following the twill blocks. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 3, 4, 1, 4, and so on. But now you're putting in your incidentals. So we're no longer weaving on in an overshot manner where it's pattern, pick, tabby, pattern, pick, tabby. Now we're actually following a twill sequence, and we're following it based on the threading, or we're following it in our own pattern design that we've come up with. And this is how they get this beautiful woven effect of all of the blended color, where your pattern yarn might be it might be thicker, it might be a different texture, it might be a different color, and then you've got this twill ground that's following underneath, that's maybe the same weight as the warp, or it's maybe two very closely related colors to one another, or it's a different texture. There's all sorts of things. Now you can see, if you look 5 picks down in the draft, so if you look at the actual color and weave part of it, and you look at, there's dark bluey purple, purple, fuchsia, purple, and then you've got 2 picks of that purple, and you're probably like, Rachel, you made a mistake. No, I didn't. This is the fascinating thing about what happens is your incidental that you need to be able to bridge that gap from the A block to the B block becomes your second ground X. So it becomes, 1, 2, 3, 2, and then you need your incidental, and that's woven with ground X because that comes after ground Y, but then you start again. So that might be it might sound confusing, but when you see it in a chart and you see it actually laid out, like here, all of a sudden it makes sense. And so you get these double pattern picks of the ground X every time you change a block. And it's not going to be within the block, it's going to be when you go to the next block. And it creates just a very, like, you can see how blended and how beautiful this is. And you've got that pattern following along in that bright fuchsia purpley color. And then that fuchsia, I did the turquoise just so that you could see where ground Y weaves. And let's say you're skipping 2 blocks, and so you're going to end up with ground X, ground Y pattern, ground X for your first incidental, ground X for your next incidental, ground X for your next incidental, and then ground X to start your next block. So maybe you put ground Y in there to keep the pattern going, but you don't have any pattern for a little bit. Isn't that cool? So cool. And you're sticking with your twill progression. So 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, and so on. And you build your blocks up until you're ready to put those incidentals in to go to the next block, or to skip a couple of blocks, or to keep with the pattern. Very cool. And that is how you start to create this amazing color and weave that is talked about. And actually, one of the things that was really inspiring, I don't know if I'll be able to find it really quickly, but this book is full of different color and weave effects. I did mark it, but like, look at very neutral color and weave. So this is your primary block, the block that follows, block B, block C, and block D. So these are your background blocks, and this is your pattern block that you're treadling, and this is the block that is following. So A, B, C, D. I don't know if that actually is the case, like in that particular row, but that's how it looks. So if you look down below here, your pattern block, block 1 that's weaving, threads 1 and 2, which actually is right here. Have a look at your purple, the bright purple, the lighter purple. It's going over 3 blocks, just over 2, it would be your right, my left. It's going over 3, under 1, over 3, under 1. And then in the next block that follows it, it's going over 3, under 1, over 3, under 1. But then if you look below, the ground Y flipped and is doing the opposite in the 2 blocks. So it's going under 3, over 1, under 3, over 1, and then over 3, under 1. And then your ground is doing the opposite. So that's what gives your blocks a different look and a different, one is the sort of main block, but then the block that follows all of a sudden changes. And you can see how right here, this is a background block in this particular row. And so now you have more, it's more warp faced. You've got all those white threads coming through because everything is going under 3/1 except for your turquoise. Isn't that cool? That's so cool. And it's a completely different way of looking at Crackle, like totally different. So I did try this on the loom and I did like see how it all played out, and I'll hopefully be able to insert some video so that you guys can see. So thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it when you spend time with me in this place. I would appreciate it if you would take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We are this close to 10,000 subscribers. So just hitting that subscribe button really helps me to pop up over that magical number. If you could do that, I would really appreciate it. And I thank you so much. Also take a minute to like, and I hope that you enjoyed and got something from this. And hopefully we'll be talking a little bit more about Crackle in the next welfordWEAVES episode. I'll go into some more of the details around incidentals, classic Crackle versus woven as overshot manner, all that different stuff. Why Crackle in overshot looks different from overshot designed as overshot and woven as overshot. We'll talk a little bit about that. So until next time, happy weaving. I hope that you're creating amazing things on your looms, and I'll talk to you then. Bye everyone.